Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Evaluating Progress in Couple and Family Therapy. So today we are going to be talking about evaluating progress in couple and family therapy. And if you have one of my family therapy textbooks, I guess this is my Mastering Competencies textbook. And if you have my case documentation in counseling and psychotherapy, this also kind of goes along or parallels a lot of what's in that book, that chapter as well. But what we're going to talk about today is, as a practicing clinician, this is for practicing clinicians. This is not for researchers. If you're doing your dissertation, you're probably going to be sorely disappointed. But this is like what you can be doing as a practicing clinician in terms of evaluating progress. And just it is a brief introduction that is part of my theory textbooks, but I think it's important to be thinking about this from the very beginning. And most people read these books in the first, second semester of their graduate programs. And so I put this in there to just kind of get this seed planted. Many of you will work at organizations where they have the built-in predetermined measures. And so we'll talk just a little bit about how to think about using some measures in your clinical work in a very, very practical way. I mean, most clinicians these days are seeing 25 to 30 people per week. We're not doing super complex stuff. And so I really wanted this chapter to focus on what is practical and realistic in contemporary workplaces. Okay, so let's jump in and get started. So, over the years, therapists have been increasingly asked to evaluate progress in more formal ways. Certainly more so than when I joined this profession. This was not talked about very much in my graduate program, to be honest. We didn't do it in my training sites, but I think things have really changed over the past 3 decades in terms of the expectation that therapists evaluate progress in increasingly formal ways. I'm just checking the chat to make sure all is good here. Oh, wow, we got folks from New Zealand. Love it, love it. In Delaware, people keep joining. So we got 2 general options. One are non-standardized measures, and to say that those don't exist, is not good. But we still have non-standardized measures that we'll talk briefly about. But then because these are more subjective, this is the client and therapist kind of subjective reports of progress. These are a data point. These are important. You need to still have these data points to compare it with more formalized standard measures, which are, developed by statisticians. They're, usually standardized with a population, and they're more specific tracking certain things. So they're considered objective. They're often considered more true. And that, I would say that they offer a different perspective, and they offer an important perspective, and they can be very, very, very useful. But you have to put all these data points together to really get the full picture, what the therapist is subjectively saying, what the client's subjectively reporting, and what the standardized measures are telling us. And so always think of this as having multiple data points, and ideally they all line up. And when they don't line up, you need to have some conversations about that. So it's something to be thinking about, that these are not the God-given truth. There's a lot of utility. There's a lot of good information that we get from these standardized measures, and you should always be hoping that it aligns with the subjective reports, that these objective measures should be lining up with objective reports. And if not, it's real important to have a conversation. So let's talk briefly about these non-standardized evaluations. So these are verbal or written descriptions by either the client or the therapist. But increasingly, that third-party providers are requiring that client evaluate their progress in addition to the therapist descriptions. And again, this can be done through a scaling question. It can be done through a formal measure. But, most progress notes historically have been the therapist is the, expert who is determining whether or not there is progress. And it is increasingly important to have the client's perspective as well as these standardized measures. So there are organizations that have shifted to having clients complete progress checklists or progress assessments where clients are filling something out. You will see that sometimes. But in general, these self-reports are considered less reliable than standardized measures in the sense that they're subjective, and they're generally considered less reliable. But like I said, as a clinician who's been doing this for many years, and especially when you work with diverse clients, or if you work with couples and families, right, you have a lot of different perspectives that you are working with in the room. And so ideally, all the therapist perspective, the client's perspective, and the standardized measure, these should all line up. And if your client has multiple parties in it, like a couple or a family, you want everyone to be feeling like progress is being had. So I think it's the key is to have all of these data points align. So in terms of non-standardized assessment, several easy ways. You could ask clients to assess their progress since the last meeting, just verbally doing it. Are things better, worse, the same, or in what area? Um, one of the things, and you could also use scaling questions on a scale from 1 to 10. So for example, and especially if clients have multiple symptoms or multiple problems, I will even have them do something like, scale each problem separately, and I once had a client, for example, who came in where they had, sorry, I'm gonna have to grab a little iced tea here, which is my jet fuel to keep me talking. Um, yeah, I once had a client who came in saying that she had OCD. It was during the pandemic. She'd been going in person to an OCD specialty center in Los Angeles during the pandemic, that she wasn't able to continue services there, found me. And, it turned out though, when I assessed kind of her forms of anxiety, she had three distinct anxiety patterns. And if you think of interaction patterns, which I talk a lot about in my books, it was an internal, not an interactional pattern as much as an internal, dialogue she'd have with herself that had a very distinct pattern. And she actually had three forms and three kind of anxiety cycles she did in a given week. And yes, one was OCD, but she had one that was around her schoolwork and how she was handling anxiety related to homework. And then there was another one related to handling anxiety in her dating relationship. And so each week when she'd come in, we would just scale where she was with each one of these three forms of anxiety. So even if you're scaling anxiety, it can be very useful. And when I teach my therapy that works unifying framework, I teach how to, assess these interaction patterns. And this person had three distinct kind of anxiety cycles that she did, I call them. And so we would rate each one of those week to week. Very, very useful, especially for me starting a session. And she would come in um, and start the session, knowing what to scale and where each one was, and she was tracking it. So it really became useful for her as a shorthand as well to just kind of self-assess, how am I doing week to week, and just being aware of this during the week in terms of which form of anxiety was better or worse. Um, so, so you can document the clients and your own clinical assessment of progress. Typically, it's in a narrative style, using phrases or sentences. And you can also use a scale, 1 to 10 scale to do so. So standardized evaluations is what most of us will think of as evaluating progress. I just had to do the non-standardized measures to just get that out of the way and on the table, and to know that that's something that historically all of us have been doing all the time and should be continuing to do. But I think what we're seeing is much more of a push to add some of this standardized evaluation, because it is considered more accurate, more valid, more objective than non-standardized measures. And you know my opinion on that. Typically, these are going to involve either pen or paper or electronic questionnaires that you would give to a client. And it's completed by the client or significant others, especially if they're children. So one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're working with a family, like let's say you have a family, you're working with a child, each person has their own unique frame of reference. So if you have, let's say, the father versus the mother fill out the form, you would get different information. So keep that in mind. And yes, it's always more convenient for your clients to just have one parent fill it out, but it can be very valuable to have both perspectives. And it can be hard to interpret the scores, especially when we start moving into couple and family work, um, that you really want to be kind of aware of that. And so also knowing that some of these measures are considered less accurate with diverse clients if they weren't standardized on diverse clients. When you think in terms of, age, race, gender, even social economic status, education level is huge when you're using these standardized measures, ability. So you want to be thinking about these things, and diversity variables that could affect a person's ability to actually complete the measure, understand what they're filling out, as well as what is the sample that the measure was standardized on. Because if the standard, was not very diverse, or it was primarily male, or it was primarily, with the middle or upper class, educated folks that, college students. So much research is done at college students because they are just easy subjects to find, right? So especially when you get into, smaller and even smaller studies or smaller surveys or instruments. And I get more and more suspicious. If something is free, often it is not. It wasn't a lot of money didn't go into making it. There are some exceptions in our field, and I will let you know about those. But so all these free surveys online, if they're not standardized, you need to be careful in terms of using them in your clinical practice. There's so many folks who I know do the MBTI stuff or whatever online, and it can't hurt, but I think clinically it's better for us to do it verbally than it is to just kind of rely on who knows who created those surveys, this free thing online. Who knows what the norming group was like. And so when you're using measures, you should take the time as a professional to be aware of who those tests were normed on and to make sure they are somewhat similar to the clients that you were using these measures on. So, um, when you're using a standard instrument, you do want to be cautious in terms of when you are interpreting them to make sure, your client is just checking a box at the end of the day, is XYZ a concern for you frequently, often, never. So this is, again, there's a certain amount of subjectivity there. They are standardized, but even how a person might interpret that. I was just talking with a clinician about something. I forget. I was staffing a case with one of my supervisees, and they were saying that their client filled out this form, but the form said, "Has this ever been a problem for you?" And it was related to sexual behaviors, and the client was said, well, was in their 50s, and they said, no, never. But verbally, when they talked to the therapist, they said, all this stuff was an issue when they were younger. And the therapist, the question was, did you ever have this be an issue? And the client just said, well, since it's not, they just interpreted it in the totally wrong way. Like the client just made up, it was something they didn't want to admit to. So even though the question was crystal clear, it was not ambiguous. Has this sexual thing ever, behavior ever been an issue for you? And they said never, but it had been. And that's just because they chose to interpret the question the way they wanted to. So we have to still be cautious, double check. And like I said, the client's objective reports, the therapist's observations, and the measures, with the information coming back in the measures, they should all align and make sense, or we need to slow down and have cautions. So when you do get results that are unexpected, you want to sit down and talk with clients about how they interpreted those specific questions that they checked in the survey. I think another really important thing that a lot of people miss is the impact that using measures has on a relationship. When you use a questionnaire of any kind, any type of measure, anything that looks like a standardized measure that a client's filling out, knowing that you are using this to assess the severity or what type of problems they have, that it affects the therapeutic relationship. And so it's very important that you think about this and address this, especially since most of these are used in the first session or in the intake set of paperwork. And so you want to think about how those instruments are going to affect the therapeutic relationship and how the client might see you. It certainly does create a little more hierarchy. And for some clients, it's going to create maybe a little more distance, right? Because they may be uncomfortable, they may feel more judged. It creates a much more clinical relationship. And if you're working from an approach or philosophy where you want to have a much more collaborative, side by side working relationship, then you need to make sure that you talk about these measures, how you're using, being public, being transparent about how these are being used so that the client can feel safe and feel like a partner in interpreting and using these measures. So in terms of the presentation, you can consider how to present formal assessment results to clients. Hopefully you get supervision from someone if you are new to doing this. And if you're an independent practitioner listening to this, to really think about, do you set this up, your presentation of the results, in such a way that really creates the type of relationship that you want? Some of us have more collaborative side-by-side relationships. Some of us use approaches where there is more of a hierarchy. And you can use measures with either more collaborative or more hierarchical, totally up to you. But you want to be thoughtful about how using and talking and presenting these results affects the relationship and making sure that your relationship stays consistent. So if you're going for a more collaborative side-by-side relationship, democratic relationship, and then you get into presenting the results and you're real hierarchical, that sends a real mixed signal to your client. And so you just want to be thoughtful about if you are going to talk about the scores with your clients, how you're doing that. And we'll give you some examples, as we go through this. But there's certainly ways to present this where you're like, hey, look, this is what the survey found, or this is what this questionnaire found. What are your thoughts about it? This is what I was thinking, how it aligns with what you said, or maybe didn't align with these other things that you said. What are your thoughts? It's a much more collaborative way to use a measure, bring the client's voice in. Alternatively, if you have a more formal hierarchical relationship to the client, you can use it to reinforce that this is what was found. And you can still ask for their feedback, but it can be done where it's not as much as a collaborative interpretation as you're presenting a more formal interpretation than asking for feedback. They similar, but it can feel very different on the receiving end of the client. So again, helping clients make sense of whatever results you present to them in the context of the therapeutic relationship in a way that it all feels consistent to the client who's on the receiving end of these results, and also trying to form a relationship with you that is consistent and coherent. And again, when you're working with diverse clients, to be particularly sensitive and really go out of your way to create space for them to share their honest reflections and feedback. For example, even just working with women, many women tend to be people pleasers and not like to create conflict. And so you will, in cases like that, right, you can give multiple choice options, often helps a person find their voice. You can go out of your way, though, to slow down. Is this part making sense? Or on a scale ask them to scale sometimes, you can get more of their opinion. So just even being attentive to your client's unique personality type and style and communication style to know whether or not, if they disagree, are they even going to say anything to you? If they're offended, are they going to say anything to you? And certainly the earlier in treatment it is, the less likely it is that they are going to voice their disagreement. So it's our job to go out of our way to make sure it's safe to disagree.